Thanks, Karen, and welcome everyone. I'm so glad to see you. My name again is Clarence Moriwaki, and this is the talk I give for Humanities Washington. And we've all been in Zoom for, lockdown for a year now. So we've all done this. You've all probably done a PowerPoint or presented one or produced one or have to suffer through one. So I'm giving you all fair warning that this is a PowerPoint presentation, but I certainly hope that you don't find mine torturous. I call this a story of four H's: history, honor, healing, and hope. Must start with history and honor the indigenous people, the Suquamish tribe who was here in the Salish Sea for about 10,000 years and here in central Puget Sound. And of course, Bainbridge Island was part of their area where they would fish and migrate. And their most famous son was Chief South, who is the namesake for the city of Seattle. The first Europeans did not arrive to our region until 1792. This is an artist's depiction of Captain George Vancouver's boat, the HMS Discovery. And in 1841, the United States Navy came to this area with a group headed up by U.S. Navy Lieutenant Charles Wilkes. One of our schools is named after him. He circumnavigated our island and named it after his good friend Commodore William Bainbridge, who never set foot on Bainbridge Island. One thing they found from Canada all the way down to Northern California to all the way down to Northern California were these massive old growth forests, and anywhere near the water or some other means of transportation, mills popped up everywhere. This is a medium-sized tree, maybe only 400 or 500 years old. Many of them were well over 1,000. And so those mills came up, and the South Harbor, south of Bainbridge, Eagle Harbor now this is Blakely Harbor. And at its peak at the end of the 19th century, this was the largest lumber mill in the entire world. It brought people in from everywhere: Croatians, Swedes, Norwegians, of course, the Japanese, Filipinos, and they all worked together in the mill. You notice something in the background there. That's not burned out trees. That's the Hall Brothers Shipyard, which again brought in all these people from around the world to work together. And because they all started working together in this mill and also the shipyard, it became a very tight-knit community because you had to really rely on your coworkers for not only work, but for watching over your safety. The US Census Bureau came by in the 1880s, and for many years they chose that names like mine, Moriwaki, or other Japanese names were too difficult to spell and or pronounce, so they simply didn't bother. And for many years you were known by your number. This is a map of what that area looked like at its peak and its production in the late 19th century, early 20th century. You can see near the mouth of the harbor, above the words Blakely Harbor, are the Hall Brothers shipyards. You can move your eyes to the left, close to the mouth of the harbor. You'll see where the mill was located. I'm going to focus on the lower left, right to the left and lower of the mill site, and it's called Nagaya and Yama. Nagaya was the pioneer town of where the Japanese came over and worked in the mill. And when they brought over their families, either through a prearranged marriage or they were waiting for them in Japan, Yama, which means mountain or hill in Japanese, was where the families lived. And so they had a lot of pride in their homes. You can see this is a picture of the Yama area. Now, everybody came and worked at the mill. Most Japanese came in the 1880s because of a massive recession that took place in that country. And so, yes, they worked at the mill, but many of them were professionals and entrepreneurs. So they basically started the company town. They built the Washington Hotel, a restaurant. Mr. Takayoshi had his mercantile store. There's a bathhouse. Mr. Takayoshi's most popular business was the ice cream parlor. But everybody who worked at these mills, everybody who worked at the lumberyard, at the shipyard, came and shopped at the Japanese businesses. So they were patrons, they became close, they got to know each other. And so this island was humming along and they took a lot of pride in their properties. But then the mill burned down not only once, but twice. And in its second burn down, by then, all of the old growth trees of which this mill was built to cut had pretty much been exhausted in this region. And so people had to find other things to do. One of the things that the Japanese did was they had a lot of World War I surplus dynamite, and they started blowing up stumps and creating these large fields. And this is the picture of one of the strawberry fields. The Marshall strawberry was well known and very beloved, known around the world, and also started other businesses. This is a picture of Mr. Harui. He started Bainbridge Gardens. This is his store. He had a gas station. And much like it was at the mill, in the mill days, this island frequented their local stores. It was a tight, close ecosystem, both socially, economically. It wasn't like today where you just jumped on a ferry and went to Seattle. That was a very rare trip. So this community from the very get-go was tight-knit. Also, one of the things that also kept us tight-knit was we were one of the first states, as most of you probably know, as one of the first who had compulsory public education, which meant, of course, you must go to school. That's the law. And I would suggest that no child is born prejudiced. And so here are all these children getting along, and things were going very well on our island. And then December 7th, 1941 happened. That's when the imperial forces of Japan came to the US territory of Hawaii and bombed the Sixth Fleet inside of the Pearl Harbor base. On that day and the day after, the FBI not only came to Hawaii, but they came to 28 cities across the country. And without search warrants or any means of any suggestion of anything wrong, they just entered the homes and they took away people from their homes. They took away mostly elders, leaders of the community, and put them in incarceration centers. On Bainbridge Island, the FBI arrived here on February 4th. And with the assistance of the Kitsap County Sheriff's Department and the Washington State Patrol, they hit all 50 Japanese American homes simultaneously. I'm talking February 1942. There were no Google GPS or anything like that at all. It was a very rural town. Many of these places had no addresses. They were just farm roads and ends of through the forest, and that's where their houses were, their cabins or whatnot. And yet they had actionable data of exactly where everybody was, and that seems to suggest that there were people on the island that acted as intelligence for them. But also we discovered in 2007 that the US Census Bureau had been giving the FBI all of the actionable data. Census Bureau data is confidential. It's not to be shared with other agencies, especially law enforcement, but they did that. That was one of the reasons why they were so successful in rounding up these people. This is just 2 days after Pearl Harbor. And you can see all these cities. You can see that there's 22 cities. They went coast to coast. And they rounded up actually 1,291 people, again, with no search warrants, charges, or reasons. On December 11th, 1942, just a few days after that bombing, the Western Defense Command was created. And this is a picture of Lieutenant General John DeWitt as its commander. A few months later, on March 2nd, 1942, he issued his first public proclamation number 1. It designated military areas in the western halves of California, Washington, and Oregon, and parts of Arizona. And these areas had a curfew imposed. All people of Japanese ancestry must remain in their home from 8 o'clock in the evening until 6 in the morning. Did not apply to Italian Americans or German Americans, which we also had declared war upon. A couple of months after Pearl Harbor, on February 19th, this is a day that we call the Day of Remembrance. This is when Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democrat, signed his executive order. And this order authorized military authorities to exclude civilians from any area without any trials or hearing. About a month later, on March 18th, 1942, FDR signed Executive Order 9102, and it created the War Relocation Authority. And this was a civilian agency in charge of managing the concentration camps. And Milton Eisenhower was its first director. About a month and a couple of days after signing that executive order, soldiers showed up on Bainbridge Island on March 24th, and they posted Civilian Exclusion Order number 1. The order stated that all persons of Japanese ancestry will be removed in 6 days, and you will only be allowed to take what you could carry or wear. 3 families prior to the removal moved to Moses Lake. And everybody had to show up at the Anderson Hardware Store, which on Bainbridge Island is now the Pegasus Coffee Shop. And everybody had to show up in person. You can see families there with their children. And on that day, the poster was up on the 24th. This picture was taken on March 25th. This is Mr. and Mrs. Evansto Oroto and Mickey Oroto. And they were looking nice and happy in this picture, but I would suspect that sometime after this picture was taken, they probably weren't smiling, because Mr. Oroto was informed that since he is a Filipino American, he is not allowed to go with his wife. He, of course, wanted to go. The order said only Japanese. He protested. We've been told that he said, "I will renounce my American citizenship. I just want to be with my wife." But the government would not allow it. So when the day came, he had to stay back on the island. They only had 6 days notice to do what they could with their properties. The Bainbridge Island Japanese had a lot of property, they owned them. It's worth noting at this point that the alien land laws of 1942, 22, did not allow people of any Asian background to own property. It was against the law. There were some of the first generation people who had owned property prior to that law, but then after that, you were not allowed. And yet Bainbridge Islanders were still buying property. And the way they were able to do this was that they put land in the title of their children's names, which of course the children are born here and they're American citizens, so they had rights to property. Almost every Japanese American farmer who had a farm, their neighbor pledged to look after their property, make sure the taxes were paid, protect their implements and all that kind of thing. And so again, part of the tight-knit community that we had. And you had to figure out what to do with all your possessions. And then on March 30th, which is coming up on Tuesday, this is when the boat arrived. This is the ferry Colocan arriving at the then Winslow Ferry Dock. And it would go to the other side of the harbor shortly after to Eagledale Ferry Dock on the south side of Eagle Harbor. If you couldn't get there, the government gave you free transportation with troop carriers. And everybody had to go. This is a picture of the few orphans we had on the island. And this is Reverend Hirakawa on the right. Here's the oldest person on Bainbridge Island. At the time, he was 77 years old. I'm talking about the emojis here. They're a couple. She's in her 40s. He's in his early 50s. And they never had children. It's not clear. I've asked whether she was unable to conceive or it was simply a choice. But instead, they always had a loving dog. In this case, it was King. King was well known on the island. You can see a white Samoyed is pretty exotic today, and it certainly was 79 years ago. And he was also known for being very kind and never barking, never biting anybody. Children could run on his back, we've been told. And King wanted to go. He certainly wanted to be with his parents, if you will. The two soldiers that you see there then had to remove King, and for the first time in this dog's life, he started barking, attempting to bite, and fought not to go. The truck was driving away. The soldiers had to restrain King as the truck was being pulled. The emojis, like other families I mentioned, their neighbor said, yes, we will look after your farm. And of course, we'll look after King. He's part of your family. But the dog was so despondent that he refused to eat or drink, and he died in a week. This is a picture of Fumiko Hayashida. She's 31 years old in this photograph. That's a picture of her daughter, Natalie. She's 13 months old, and she is pregnant with her third child, it will be Leonard, who would be the first baby born in an American concentration camp. She plays a big role in our story, and I'll talk about her later. The soldiers became very close to the community. They did everything they could. They were very generous. And high school seniors came to the ferry dock to say goodbye to their friends. And Walt Woodward, who was the publisher of the Bainbridge Review and editor, he interviewed the commanding officer, and he said that we don't know why we're here. We don't know why we're doing it to these people. This is the hardest thing we ever had to do. Woodward also noted that almost every soldier had tears in their eyes. The ferries finally arrive, and you can see the soldiers marching down. The ferry is off picture to the left, and you can see the Japanese Americans and their friends who have driven them in their cars, and they're gathering, assembling, waiting for the order. The ferry arrived at 11:03 that morning, and 227 Japanese Americans marched down to Eagledale Ferry Dock. They boarded the ferry Colocan, riding over to Seattle, and they arrived at the current ferry dock in Seattle. They had to board this train. They had to keep the blinds closed. Here's the Hayashida family saying goodbye. And they went for 3 days, 2 nights with the blinds closed, and arrived here in Lone Pine, California, in the high Sierra deserts between Los Angeles and Lake Tahoe. From there, they boarded a bus, and they rode another few hours and arrived at the Manzanar concentration camp under construction. And they were the first Japanese American group to live in any concentration camp. And this picture was taken the day after they arrived. They arrived on April 1st, April Fool's Day, 1942. And these are some Californian men who are building those barracks. These barracks were very inhospitable. They broke them up into units of 20 by 25. You can see they're just the walls there, the boards. On the outside of that is tar paper, and that's it. There's no insulation, no sheetrock even. You can see that They had these cots. When the first several thousand came to these camps, again, they could only take what they could carry away, so there were no mattresses or whatnot. So everyone got a large sack and a small sack, and the camps had large bales of hay throughout them, and everybody was instructed to fill those bags up. And the larger one would serve as your mattress, and the smaller one would be your pillow. Each of these rooms had one bare light bulb and one stove, and the walls did not go to the ceiling. So you're basically, 4 families or up to 32 people in a very long barn. And this is a picture of how you kind of made do with your barrack space. This is a model of what Manzanar looked like at its full build out. By September of 1942, more than 10,000 Japanese Americans were crowded into 504 barracks on this property. And you can see they're organized into blocks, and there were 36 of those. And in those blocks, if you'll notice in the center of the barracks, there's 2 smaller buildings. Those would be the man and woman latrines. The center longer building is the mess hall, and then there is a latrine facility at the end. And these barracks were 100 feet long by 20 feet wide, broken up into 4 barracks. So they would be those 20 by 25 foot apartments, if you will, that I just described. All of these camps were located in very desolate areas across the country, as far east as Arkansas. And they're all different, but they all had several things in common. And I just wonder if the government did this by design, but they were all blistering hot places, desolate places in the summer, and blowing windstorms and sandstorms, and in the winter just the opposite, freezing. Again, no insulation in these buildings, certainly no pavement, let alone gravel, so the roads and walkways were just terribly hard to get around with all the mud. This is a hard thing, especially for the first generation Japanese Americans who prided themselves in modesty and family unity, and here you're crowded around with all these strangers, and it was a very hard transition for them. Things like sharing latrines with no partitions. Now, all 10 camps had various stories to tell, but one that's a uniform story that I've found is that people have memories of watching elders go to the latrines at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, why do they remember this? Well, first of all, those elders wanted to go at those times when they had some modicum of privacy, and that was the only time because most people were asleep. But all 10 camps had searchlights that searched and went through all the property constantly, looking for people who might be trying to escape or something. So when they saw movement, like an elder person walking out of their barracks, they would spotlight you as if you were, the lead thing on a Broadway stage, and people would notice it because the lights would stop moving. And so they would look out the window and they would watch this person, spotlit, the only thing you can see, to the latrine, and they would hold that light on the latrine until that person left, and then follow them back to wherever the barracks they started. The elders found it hard to be with all these people. You didn't have that family unity. You didn't have that, 3 meals together a day event. You were with these strangers. And what happened was the young people, the second generation Nisei, started hanging out with different people. And they went to other blocks where the food may have been better, or the boys and girls were cuter, or where their friends are. And this started breaking up family unity. It was a very difficult thing for the elders to deal with, but this was their new reality. And for the most part, again, there were all different stories, but they wanted their children to have as normal a life as possible, because this was a prison sentence with no known ending. They didn't know if they're going to be here 6 months, 6 years, or their entire lives. So they wanted to make it as normal as possible for their children. So they made sure, especially education, which is very important in the culture. One of the things that they loved being in America was education was free here. In Japan, it was really a privilege. It's very expensive. Only people who could afford it and had certain privileges or class could attend school, but every child in America could attend school, and that they thought was remarkable. And they wanted to make sure that it was just like what it would be like if they weren't behind barbed wire. So they had all the activities, sports and dances, and theater. And here's a converted barracks for a dance with the teenagers. And sports was a big activity to keep the children active. Here's some girls playing basketball outside of the camp at Manzanar. Now, all 10 camps, again, had different experiences, but all 10 camps did one thing, and that is they had love of baseball. And so it was up to the incarcerees to do that. That was not going to be provided by the military. So the incarcerees built their own baseball diamonds and fields, And here they are at Manzanar. You can see the thousands and thousands of people crowded around watching the game. They could play against each other. Man, again, these are places that had up to 14,000 people. So it's like a small town. So you could field a lot of baseball teams. And I'm hearing somebody in the background there. And so they started playing other. They start. They started playing other teams. They invited schools from the outside, high schools, colleges, military teams to play because they needed some other opposition. And they were very good players. I'm told that every one of the 10 camps had winning records. So here's a picture that Toyo Miyatake took. You can see the guard tower off in the distance, and they're staring out, looking past the camp. Here's a map of a lot of things. One, you can see where the exclusion zone was located. Here in Washington State, it followed the Columbia River. It hit a town called Brewster, and it followed that Highway 75 all the way up north to Canada. In Oregon, it was west of Hood River and out to the Bend, as you can see in Oregon, California, and southern Arizona. And if you were in the west side of this, the left side, the darker pink area, and you're 1/16 Japanese, you were going to be forcibly removed. That was 114,000 people. Another 6,000 children would be born within one of those 10 triangles, which represents the concentration camps. All told, that was 120,000 plus Japanese Americans who were forcibly removed from that zone. We were at war with Germany and Japan, Germany and Italy, but there were no mass concentration camps for any Italians or Germans. That would have been a physical impossibility. There were about 4 million Italians and about 10 million Germans. So the Bainbridge Islanders I just described, they left on March 30th and they arrived at Manzanar, you can see on the map, on April 1st. And after about a month, most of them petitioned to go to Minidoka, where everybody from Seattle was located. They wanted to be close to them, and they wanted to get away from the Los Angeles Japanese Americans that dominated the camp, because it was like mixing the city mice with the country mice, as they described it, and a lot of friction between the urbanist Japanese Americans and these rural, naive country mice, if you will. And once they got the notice of to transfer to Minidoka, the Bainbridge Review editor, Walt Woodward, had a nice commentary. He said, this is a smart move because you really shouldn't mix Washington apples with California lemons. So here's a map of the what was called assembly centers. Now, I told you that Bainbridge Island went straight to the Manzanar camp, but you saw it was just getting under construction. And so you're going to eventually house more than 100,000 people. They could not build the concentration camps fast enough. So instead, they had these temporary areas that were called assembly centers that people were held until the camp was ready for occupancy. And here in Washington State, in orange, the Seattle and Pierce County areas went to the Puyallup Fairgrounds. In dark blue, Kitsap and most of King County went to the Pinedale Assembly Center outside of Fresno, California. And in green, the rest of Western Washington went to the Tule Lake in Northern California concentration camp. And in light blue, Eastern Washington went to the Portland, Oregon Fairgrounds. Now, you notice I said the Portland, Oregon Fairgrounds, the Puyallup Fairgrounds, Santa Anita Racetrack. There are a lot of these places that used to house animals. Now, they're also building barracks at the fairgrounds and at the racetrack, but the first several thousand people who came to those places, they didn't have the barracks again constructed for them. So they were sent to the livestock stalls, where just sometimes days before, a horse or a cow or a pig or some other livestock had occupied, and just basically put the people in, some still with not very cleaned out dried feces and the rest. So once the concentration camps were built, the government called them euphemistically relocation centers. And I'd like to draw your attention to some of the maps. You can see the pullout of the Los Angeles region, the San Francisco Bay Area. You can see Bainbridge Island, Seattle. Especially in those areas, look how it's a mosaic, how they broke up the Japanese American community deliberately. Now, you would think logistically that it would be a smart move if you're going to move thousands and thousands of people, that you would want your military to concentrate. Okay, here's a block of 1,000 or a region of 1,000. Let's take those 1,000. But they deliberately broke them up and sent them to totally different areas in different parts of the country, because their plan was to split up the entire community. They thought that we could cut the head off the snake, that if we could break up this communication, there would be no spy networks and there would be no things untoward happening to America. Here in Washington State, the red area and Pierce County went to Minidoka, as I earlier mentioned. The rest of Western Washington were already at the Tule Lake camp, which later became a concentration camp and then a place for resistors. And in Eastern Washington, all those folks went to the Hart Mountain concentration camp in Wyoming. At its peak, this is what the population of those camps were. I mentioned just Hart Mountain, Wyoming. At the time, Hart Mountain, Wyoming was the largest city in Wyoming. And these were where all these people were housed. And you're in the camps and you're trying to make the best of what you can there. And this is a picture of Kay Sakai Nakau. She's holding her son, Bruce. She was a wonderful mother of our community, and she just recently passed away. She had 100 years old. As the war went on, we were losing a lot of people. We lost about 400,000 lives in World War II all total. And so they came to the camps and they asked young Japanese American men and women if they would like to enlist in the military. And then there was later a draft of all these folks. Bainbridge Island answered the call, and out of 276 Bainbridge Islanders, 68 of them went and served in the military, either by enlisting or drafting. This is a picture of Art Kuro with his wife Flo, married while he was in uniform, and he was part of 18 people from our island who was in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. This was a venerated unit of segregated Japanese Americans who fought in Europe against the Italians and Germans. I would like to highlight one of their big stories. There was a group of Texas Rangers, the Lone Star Battalion, they called them, and they became the Lost Battalion because they were pinned down by the Axis forces in northern Italy for quite a while. 2 attempts by the Allies to rescue them failed. They were repelled and became a big news story back home. The 442nd had just fought a 5-day battle elsewhere. They just arrived at this scene. They were given 1-day rest and ordered to go up and save the Lost Battalion, and they did. It took them 5 days, and they were successful. They saved 211 out of those 275 soldiers, but they gave 161 lives. They had 1,200 casualties, and 42 of them were captured by the Nazis. This was so revelatory because this was covered in the media, and it started changing a lot of people's perceptions about who these Japanese Americans were, their bravery and their loyalty and their courage. They looked like, well, they really aren't the enemy. These truly are Americans. Now, there's something called the Presidential Unit Citation, which the president can give to exceptional groups of a ship in battle, like a unit like the 442nd. Only about 5% of military units ever get the Presidential Unit Citation. The 442nd got 7. This is President Harry Truman giving him that 7th Presidential Unit Citation. And he said, "You not only fought the enemy, you fought prejudice, and you won." Now, I told you they were drafted, I mean, they enlisted and drafted, but even while they were drafting people, they still didn't trust people who looked like me. They still kind of had a suspicion about, well, you might be loyal. So one of the things they had to do was fill out a loyalty questionnaire. And these are the 2 questions that everybody focuses on, and I hope you can read them yourself. But the 27, some men would say, well, I will serve my country if you will grant us our constitutional rights and freedom, and if you will release our family from this camp, then I have a country to fight for that believes in the rule of law and the constitutional rights. But I'm not going to do that. Some said no. On the bottom, next one, it's the allegiance question, the loyalty question. And you'll notice that the part there, it says, forswear any allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor, etc. And many objected. They said, I don't even know who the Japanese emperor is. I'm an American. This is all I know. I only know Bainbridge Island, or I only know my hometown. And they found that insulting, especially the word forswear, because forswear implies that you had previous allegiance. You were unswearing something that you apparently swore. And so they said, how can you trap me in that? Because you're implying that I had allegiance. And this was a big, difficult thing with a lot of families because of how they were viewed, because their own homes had been invaded by the FBI, and many of their fathers were still in prisons, not even in concentration camps. They were in Department of Justice incarceration centers, prisons away from the concentration camps. So those families were separated. Family separation is not a new policy in America. And so many families said, you got to answer yes. Don't say we're unloyal. And there were families where some boys said no and some said yes, and it was very difficult. And they became known as no-no boys. And I want to single out these three just in particular. Gordon Hirabayashi, he was here from the White River, Auburn area. Minoru Yasui was from Hood River, Oregon, and Fred Korematsu was from California. They all challenged the executive order in different ways. Gordon Hirabayashi, Minoru Yasui, again, these are men only in their early 20s, defied that curfew order because he said, how come you're not rounding up the Italians? How come we have to be singled out? How come you're not rounding up and telling the Germans they can't come out? And so they took their convictions, their federal convictions, all the way to the US Supreme Court. And the US Supreme Court unanimously upheld that conviction, saying, well, yeah, you're a US citizen, but the military can do what it wants. Fred Korematsu had a different route. He was hiding out with his Italian-American girlfriend. He was captured. And he said, no, I don't want to go to these camps. I have a constitutional privilege. I'm an American citizen. There was no due process. He had a very strong legal argument. And his was not a unanimous decision. It was a 6-3. But still, the Supreme Court said this was constitutional. And they made their cases. They said, again, that we're against these other countries. How can this be? Why aren't there exclusion orders for Italian-Americans? Why isn't Joe DiMaggio going to a concentration camp? Or how could history change if this German-American Dwight Eisenhower, who led the Allied forces and later became the US president after the war, imagine how history would change if you would have put all the German-Americans and Italian-Americans in concentration camps. And what Yasui, Hirabayashi, and Korematsu were arguing was this is a violation of the Constitution of the United States. The Fourth Amendment is the one that says you are safe in your persons and property. Again, they went through all these homes with not one search warrant, let alone one charge. And that's a clear violation. The Fifth Amendment is a really powerful amendment, and you can read it for yourself there, but it says no person shall. And as far as I've learned, and I've been giving this presentation for about 10 years now, understand that among democracies and republics in the world, we're the only government that uses the word person. We give persons rights. Now, these first generation folks, even though the alien land law forbid them to even be applied for citizenship, that did not allow, the US government did not allow Japanese to apply for US citizenship until 1951. So they weren't citizens, but they're still persons. So there was a violation there. And then this, the 14th Amendment, one of the most powerful amendments in our Constitution. This is the Equal Protection Amendment. It says right in there also, any person, life, liberty, or property. But this is the naturalization. If you are born in America or in a US state or territory or property, you by birthright are a US citizen. About 75,000 of those 120,000 were American children, and they're US citizens. And this is J. Edgar Hoover, who rounded up all those people of 1/16th ancestry. And he was able to do that because he had been spying on everybody of 1/16th ancestry since the late 1930s. And he had all this data on them, yet he made no arrest because there was nothing to arrest. There were no charges or anything. And he told the president he really wanted more roundup of the German and Italians. He was more concerned about those organizations. And then Roosevelt's own Attorney General, Biddle, he challenged, he said, Mr. President, the Fourth, the Fifth, the 14th Amendments, these are US citizens. We're going to have 75,000 lawsuits. And yet Korematsu, Yasui's, and Hirabayashi's convictions were upheld. So how can that be? Well, one of the things they did was simply reclassify you. And in these documents, this is the notice. It said, all persons alien and non-alien. So you're no longer a person, you're an alien. And the US citizenship part, well, now you're a non-alien. And the US government used this as one of the reasons why they said, well, technically, you are a new subclassification of citizenship, so the government can do what it wants during war. Everybody has seen this phrase before. This is a very powerful thing that I think we should all learn. This is a picture of when you enter the Manzanar National Historic Site, you see the picture of the USS Arizona superimposed over the Twin Towers after they fell on September 11, 2001. And the lesson, this is how people reacted after World War II started. And this is how people reacted after September 11, 2001. Now, war is a strange thing. Unless you're a psychopath, you don't kill on demand. So one of the things governments have to do is to create your enemy to be not only threatening, but somehow lesser than you. So it's okay to take away this life. And the Germans in World War I made this an art form. They really demonized their enemy. Here's a Bolshevik, and you can see the menacing knife and the German mother with her children. And so you make them sinister and evil. It's interesting that they always go dark. And then, or else you make your enemy not even human. And they had other images that would border on pornographic. And we found these so appalling that after that, we said, we as Americans have higher values. We would never do this. We are a better country than that. But after World War II started, and after September 11th, I think all of you know that Mecca is a place that people of Muslim faith must go at least once in their life, and a million people show up there. Now, this next image I'm going to show you is a very popular thing that was all over the US. Kind of like today we wear yellow ribbons or perhaps a flag lapel pin to show, you know, we're patriotic and support the troops and whatnot. These were handed out by virtually every place, corporations, civic organizations, schools, churches, political groups. And after September 11th. Next one I'm going to show you was one put out by US government. This was given to the Marines. These are the ones in Hawaii after they passed their marksmanship classes. And at one point I like to point out, it says it's hereby authorized to observe open season on all Japanese wherever contacted. The license carries no bag limit and may be used to good advantage during blackout hours. Hot lead leaves them dead. The blackout hours were the curfew times. They were referring to civilian organizations. There aren't blackouts in battlefield. This is a fundraising appeal by a Republican candidate for governor. He made thousands of dollars at $10 a pop on these little things, these bumper stickers. He won his race. He later had to resign for a totally different reason. And this is a poster from a pretty liberal university just a month after September 11th in mid-October. Now, after all these years, after the war, younger people like myself, third generation, were interested in this. And so in 1976, on July 4th, the bicentennial year of our independence, this is a picture of President Gerald Ford, a Republican president, and he revoked President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066. And that opened up a dialogue. As people started opening, I can talk about this freely. But later that year, he was defeated by a Democratic governor from Georgia, Jimmy Carter. But Jimmy Carter picked up that mantle and he created a bipartisan commission of experts to examine the record and history of Japanese Americans in World War II. He called it the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. He created that in 1980, but then later that year, he was defeated by Republican governor from California, Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan then continued that study. He did not have to, but he continued carrying that on. And after consent study in December of 1982, this commission published their report, Personal Justice Denied. And after 2 years of hearings going through multiple cities, 750 witnesses, this 467-page report found that there was no documented evidence of espionage or sabotage, nor was there any military necessity for the mass exclusion and incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans, but they unanimously found that it was based on, it found that the policy of exclusion, removal, and detention was systematically conducted by the US government, despite the fact that no documented evidence of espionage nor sabotage was ever shown, and that there was no direct military necessity for the detention. So this opened up the avenues for people to want to fight back. And in the back there is Fred Korematsu, Gordon Hirabayashi, and Minoru Yasui, those three men who challenged the Supreme Court, and young people of my age, the senseis, started legal remedies to try to do this and get these convictions overturned. And it was called a writ of norum corpus. And they did. They had all of their convictions overturned, those unconstitutional convictions. And then there was the redress movement, our legislators in the front. I just want to focus on one in the middle in the front in the lighter colored suit. That's Senator Daniel Inouye from Hawaii when it became a state, the first senator from that state. Mr. Inouye is not hiding his right arm. He doesn't have a right arm. He left his right arm in Italy when he was fighting for the 442nd. And here's the Civil Liberties Act signed on August 10th, 1988, signed, and you can see all of the sponsors behind it. I want to honor the story. I mentioned Walt and Millie Woodward. They were publisher editors of the Bainbridge Review. I won't go into too much on that because you're going to be able to talk to their daughter, who we'll talk about their parents. But the one thing they did was on December 8th, they wrote a strong editorial saying, let's not rush to mob rule. These are neighbors, they're loyal. When Roosevelt signed that executive order on February 19th, it was a blistering editorial. So, Mr. President, have you not read the Constitution? He's the only newspaper throughout the entire country that held that editorial stance throughout the war, that it was an unconstitutional act. And he also supported the Japanese American community by having people write back from the camps. And you can see here are some of the articles that the Bainbridge Islanders wrote that were published inside the Bainbridge Review. And so these were two of the things that helped make this community very, very tight-knit. Out of the 276, 150 came back to the island, which is higher than anywhere. That's more than 50%. No other place had close to 15% return. But we also had, wasn't all Pollyanna. We had this white supremacist Lambert Schuyler with this publication, a practical approach to the racial problem. Kind of speaks for itself. And here's Mary's book, and I'll let her talk about that when it's her turn. So here's a picture of Fumiko Hashida. Here she is with her daughter, Natalie. Natalie had a successful career in business, and she became the mayor pro tem of El Paso, Texas. And she was our spokesperson trying to become part of the national park system. And we fought to become a National Historic Site. We asked her to testify, and she did with wonderful grace and authority. We got unanimous votes every time. And in 2008, we became a unit of the national park system. And what we want this park to be is a place of healing. And it's built on the very path. You can see the Eagle Dove ferry dock there. The dock is not there anymore, but we built the wall upon that path of which they walked to the ferry that morning. It's located on the south side of Eagle Harbor, on the other side, really south of the current Winslow Ferry dock. When you arrive at the site, you see this panel. You'll walk in further, you'll see this timber frame pavilion. You'll see these informational panels, of which I've shared much of the information with you already. You walk down to the site through this curving gravel path. You come across these three waysides, and these are pictures that tell the story just of March 30th, just that day. And you can see the pictures here. One of the reasons why we have so many incredible pictures was that the Seattle Post-Intelligencer came to our island with scores of photographers and reporters. That's why we have stories like the Mojis, because those reporters were there to witness what happened. Walk into our site, and here is the entrance, a Japanese gate. Here's our wall. It's made out of granite. And from the beginning of this wall all the way to the end, here's our motto, Nidoto Nayoni, or let it not happen again. This is exactly 276 feet long, 1 foot for every Japanese American who lived on Bainbridge Island at the start of the war. This will be the first panel you see. It just gives you an introduction to what this wall is all about. We wanted to make sure it's about the people we want to honor. And so all families are listed in alphabetical order by their name. You can also see their ages. And we have display panels. This first one, the quotation on this panel reads, "I came to Bainbridge Island in 1908. Bainbridge was a good place to raise a family. Tomokichi Nishinaka." The next panel, above the high school depiction, says, "I was born and raised on Bainbridge Island, and I'm a 100% American citizen. We will protect our flag, the United States flag, Misaki John Nakata." Above the baseball mitt, it reads, "Just a week before we were to leave, Coach Pop Miller put in all of the Japanese Americans. Despite errors and not hitting, he let us play the whole game. We lost 15-2, Paul Otaki." Underneath, above the crane, it says, "I felt like a second-class citizen to be herded onto the boat by soldiers with bayonets. It was the most humiliating experience in my life. Isami Nakao." And above the suitcase, the quotation is, "We were really careful. We were prisoners, and they had guns with spears. Fumiko Nishinaka Hayashida. This is my favorite panel. I just like the barbed wire. It's the only three-dimensional panel on it. And on the left, it reads, "The searchlights played on our windows back and forth all night. I couldn't sleep. Masami Nakao." On the right, the quotation is, "Back home at graduation, they had 13 empty chairs on the stage. That day I felt so empty and sad. I sat on my bunk and I cried." Nobuku Sakai Omoto. Here's a break in the wall. Again, the story, the wall is about Japanese American history, but for those 3.5 years, there were no Japanese on the island. They were away. And so that's why we don't have a wall in that spot. And this represents their time in incarceration. And this is the final panel that tells the end story. And you can see that at the last group, we have 3 panels together. You notice a couple of things. One, they're all color, and the other ones are fairly monochromatic. This was a deliberate design choice to make it bright. There's not a lot to be happy about during the World War II experience, but the one thing that we do celebrate on Bainbridge Island is how they stood by their friends and neighbors and looked after their properties and welcomed them home, and that is what we're trying to depict here. The first panel is, I was kind of afraid, but the neighbor girl that I used to play with came up and welcomed me, Ikiosu Imatsu Shibiyama. We put the farmer under Mr. Raber's name while we were gone. When we came back, he returned it to us, Noburakura. My father and his brother worked so hard to build up Bainbridge Gardens. When we returned, there was nothing left. It must have broken him. So you leave the site, we're on a return path, and you see all these panels along the way. And I hope you can read that on yourself. So you leave the site with our motto, go through a grove of cedar trees across the path, back to where we started. And this is our future. These are our future plans. We have a plaza plan with an outdoor amphitheater, a timber frame pavilion that speaks to the timber frame structures on the site, the pavilion, and also the wall and the gates. And we hope to do this someday in the future. We are on March 30th, this Tuesday, going to dedicate the exclusion departure deck, the 3rd phase of our construction, which represents the Ego del Ferry dock. So you walk off the island as if they did on that day. This is the Pledge of Allegiance as it was in 1942. The phrase "under God" was not added until 1951. And the bottom quotations read, "I wonder who the next exceptions will be if this democracy with her extraordinary constitution could imprison people only because of their ethnic background. It could happen again. And it could happen to anyone, black, brown, yellow, or white." Senator Daniel K. Inouye, that senator I talked about earlier. This is a quote from our president, Dr. Frank Kitamoto. He was our president of the Japanese American community for more than a quarter century. And this is one of his last public speeches before he passed away. And this was his closing line. And I really agree this is true. I agree that it is fear. I agree that people, when they have these actions, they want to blame somebody. So there was this horrible attack. So they chose to blame the Japanese. When we have something happening, you lose your job, blame the Mexicans. Right now, you lose the pandemic, blame the Asians. And this is our motto: let it not happen again. And unfortunately it is. The Asian American attacks are happening with abundance. This is a repeat of that kind of fear that was, and it has been artificially created. And quite frankly, there's an echo here. Franklin Delano Roosevelt did promote the racism. He did not back it, push away from it. And we had a previous president just a couple of weeks ago still called this the China virus. And so these activities are rising, and it raises to the level of murder last week with the woman the Asian woman in Atlanta. So this motto isn't being heard. This aspirational model is not being heard. So it's a call to action. But what I would like to suggest to you is it's better now, because people are protesting. People are protesting these anti-Asian attacks. Black Lives Matter rallies not only brought out people in the millions around our country, it went around the world. And people are speaking out. In 1942, there were no mass rallies trying to stop the military at bayonet point, taking away Japanese to trains or buses or island ferries. There were no mass groups protesting the president's unconstitutional order, nor was there anybody in Congress. Not one person in Congress raised their voice against this incredible unconstitutional action. As a matter of fact, the California delegation was really pushing this the hardest. And that was one of the big reasons why Roosevelt won. He carried California. So it was complicit. It was complicit in their actions. But today we are speaking out. We realize this is not the America we want it to be. And for that, I'm grateful. And that's why this motto is not just that aspiration. It's got to be our status. It's got to be what our nation stands for. Thank you very much. Well, welcome all. Thank you for joining us here. You're in for a really great treat. You have an actual living survivor. I've been plugging Mary enough, I think, so I think I've given her a good introduction. And Donna Harui is the daughter of, and you saw on the slideshow, I mentioned Bainbridge Gardens and the Haruis. Plus you saw one of his quotes, her grandfather's quote on the wall, that her father's quote on the wall, that it must have, so she's part of this legacy family on Bainbridge Island. So I'd like to start it out with Lily, because she is one of our original survivors. And would you like to introduce yourself and share a little bit about what you went through on that day?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
Would you
sorry.
Just simply introduce yourself, tell people who you were at the time, your family on the island, and your brief remembrances of the removal.
I'm Lily Kitamuro Kodama, and I was 7 years old at the time of the incarceration on March 30th, 1942. And if you could do high-level math, you know how old I am.
And can you, one of the stories I'd like for you to tell is, what were your feelings about going to the camps, and why do you think that was different than your parents?
Well, I was the oldest of four, and my father had already been taken away by the FBI. And so my mother was alone to get us ready. But as a 7-year-old at that time, we were pretty innocent about world events, and I had no idea of what was going on. But my mother did, and my father was a traveling salesman, so he was gone from home many times, and so I didn't think anything of him not being home. But my mother said the day before we were to leave, that tomorrow we're going to take the ferry to Seattle and it'll be like a vacation. And in those days, taking the ferry to Seattle was a special event. And I remember tossing and turning the night before with excitement because we're going to Seattle the next morning. And in the morning, one of the things I do remember is I had to wear my plaid coat and I didn't like it. And I remember arguing with my mother about having to wear this coat, but I lost. And anyway, when we got to the Eagledale ferry dock, there were all my cousins and my aunts, and there were soldiers with real guns. And so it did feel like a special occasion. And then we did take the ferry, and when we got to Seattle, we went on a train, and I'd never been on a train before. And so, and I look back as an adult, I marvel at how the mothers and families did protect and make well, anyway, I grew up thinking it was all fun and games. And I think that's remarkable. But I know that mothers must have had a whole different feeling about the whole event.
A couple of things, Lily. I wonder if you would tell your story or elaborate. Oh, hello, am I on? Yeah, I wonder if you'd just tell your story on the train itself. I mean, about the Pullman car and things like that. And then, well, I'll follow up. Go ahead.
Well, the train ride was special because I think they put um, uh, families with children on the Pullman cars. I think the others were in, uh, it wasn't cattle cars, but it was, they did not have sleeping berths. And so when the soldiers came with us on the train, and the soldiers were kind, they helped. I know they helped my mother carry my little brother who was 2, and they came with us on the train, and one of them brought his guitar, and so he would play and sing songs to us with his guitar on the train, and they also read storybooks to us. And but the nighttime came, and the porters came along, and they pulled down the upper berth, and there was a bed up there, and oh, we all got so excited, because the train ride took uh, 2 days and 3 nights, I think, or was it 3 days? Well, anyway, we had to sleep overnight on the train, and so we all argued over who gets to sleep on that top bunk. And so we solved it by playing rock, scissors, papers, and I think I won. I can't remember, but and so the whole thing was like a vacation, actually. Uh, and then when we got to the end of the line, we boarded a bus, and then we were driven to Manzanar, where the barracks waited for us. And I remember seeing the barracks, and my cousins had a farm. They grew, they had large farm of strawberries, but they also grew rhubarb, and the what we called the rhubarb house on their farmland looked exactly like the barracks. It was a long building with black tar paper that covered it, and I thought those buildings were all rhubarb houses, but they were actually our. That was where we were going to live.
What did you think of your conditions there, Lily?
Pardon me?
What did you think of your conditions there?
Oh, it was not anything like Bainbridge Island. It was all a lot of sagebrush, and it was a lot of sand and dusty, and the wind blew, and when the wind blew, it was sand that blew in our faces, and we all had to run into our barracks, but then actually the sand came up through the cracks. It was not anything like what we had here on Bainbridge Island. But we had playmates every day. I mean, they were right across they were in the barracks next door, and when you grow up on a farm, the only time you have playmates is at recess at school, and when you got together with your cousins or family was during 4th of July or special holidays. Otherwise, after school, we all had chores to do, and we didn't have playtime like children do today. And so, as I said, and then not only did we have playmates all the time, but we played games. Like it was easy to play hopscotch because it was easy to draw the marks in the sand, and we played marbles, and we played jump rope because we had our jump ropes with us. But the one thing we really had fun playing was hide and seek, and the best place to hide was under the barracks. But our mothers gathered us together and told all of us, we don't want you children to hide under the barracks because there are scorpions and rattlesnakes under there, and if either one of them bites you, you can die. And see, we never had things like rattlesnakes or scorpions here, and so anyway, I've been on pilgrimages back to Manzanar in Minidoka, and it'd be in the middle of not quite summer, but in the warm season, and people will be exploring the sites in their shorts and sandals, but I always wore my long jeans and my tennis shoes because I wasn't going to be bitten by a rattlesnake or scorpion. I mean, even as an adult, that stayed with me, and so anyway.
Well, Lily, I think that was wise, and we're glad you're here, that you
Oh, yeah.
shared stories with us. And I'm a Scorpio by birth sign, but I would have never stung you. So uh, there's another story, though. Thank you, Lily. Lily tells her story about the forced removal, but if you recall in my presentation, I talked about three families who had a chance to move to Moses Lake, my birthplace, and one of those families was the Haruri family, and we're really honored to have a member of that family here, Donna. So
Thank
yeah, so Donna, I'll leave it to you. Tell a little bit about your family here on the island first, and then the moving to their experience in Moses Lake.
Well, you showed some of the pictures of the old family store. So my grandfather did work at the lumber mill for a short time, and then he and his brother established Bainbridge Gardens, which was a 20-acre nursery with a general store and a gas station. I understand the island's first gas station. And I still have customers today who say it was just an amazing place, sunken gardens and traditional Japanese landscaping. And we were one of the families then that my father's cousin learned that if you were in Eastern Washington, you wouldn't be incarcerated. So they made the hasty decision to leave. And the story that I had heard was that Dad was 8 years old at the time and was in school and was told by the principal, go home. And said he didn't know there was a war on. He wasn't sure why he was being sent home. He thought he had done something wrong in school and came home to find the family making hasty arrangements to leave for Moses Lake.
Mm. And what was it like for, well, that's your father. What was it like for him in Moses Lake?
Well, he was 8 years old, and so he had. Of course, the cat decides to photobomb me right now. He said that at recess, I guess they were the first Japanese settlers that anyone had ever seen there. So his story was that at recess, the boys all wanted to play war, and you could guess what side I was going to be on. And so I guess he got beat up all the time. We did have a family, though, who took care of the gardens, and that did allow our family to have something to move back to. And you'd spoken to that not all families had something to come back to, but we were very fortunate that we did.
What do you think? Well, you're probably speaking from, he was quite active in trying to tell this story. Dr. Kitamoto, your father, and Don Nakata, who was one of the family founders of the Town and Country, now chain of stores. Why do you think it was so important for him to do that?
I think he really came into that because we had always heard the stories when we were young. And they were told in just the way that families relate stories of when they were little. It wasn't told with anger or animosity or even heartache. It was just, they were very matter-of-fact stories of what had happened. Mm-hmm. But he owned a nursery and florist here on Bainbridge, and in 1989, because of many reasons, decided to move back to the family home. And at that point, it was all in ruin. And as he started to restore Bainbridge Gardens, and I'm the third generation of my family to run it today, he came to really come to peace with his family's history, and he discovered many things at the gardens that are there today that Grandpa had started before the war. And it's just an amazing place, and it became part of his legacy to really see that. He used to talk often about the resilience of plants and the legacy of the trees that were left there for him, because there are many trees that were planted there by my grandfather before the war that are still there. And as he embraced the family history, I think he embraced the bigger history of the Japanese American community on the island, of course, and in general.
I think most people saw Red Pines, or they haven't, or hope you have. But all you folks watching, if you haven't seen it, please watch it, because her father is featured. Well, it's really the theme of the video. Yeah. So thanks, Donna. Is there anything you'd like to add before I move to Mary?
No, thank you. I'd love to hear Mary talk.
Yeah. Mary, are you there? Okay. So you can see her book right over there. There's Mary's book right there. And I point to it because it's a lovely piece of work. Let alone we're just friends. But if I didn't even know you, I'd say this is probably one of my favorite books of the Japanese American incarceration. I think it's a source material. So tell us a little about your parents. I glossed over them real fast because I knew you were coming to fill that gap there. So share a little bit about Walt and Millie Woodward.
I would like to preface it with sort of taking off from a point you made about growing up. Bainbridge was a different place than most places. And the reason I think why We all seem to be in agreement on it. In 1920, the last mill on Bainbridge closed. And many of the Japanese who had come, many of the Croatians and the Italians, and this was a community of immigrants, and they had all come to work at the mill. And when it closed, they needed to find work. And there was no Yama, which was the name of the place where the Japanese lived at the mill. There was no Yama any other place on the island. So they had to find work wherever it was. And they ended up with neighbors who were Croatian or Italian or Scandinavian or whatever, but probably not Japanese. Some were. So the kids got to know each other. I mean, I say, this is a perfect example of why busing works, except busing doesn't work. But if you do grow up knowing people of other races, knowing people who are different, you became friends. Children, I'm talking about children, became friends with them. And then eventually their mothers became involved. And so they realized that, oh, rice balls actually are good. And they shared things. And then when the kids got in school, of course, there were 8 elementary schools across the island, and every kid was there. So they were getting to know people, and they became close friends. And when it came time on March 30th for our neighbors to be sent away, my mother was there covering it for the review. And she said it was the most tragic to see the teenagers saying goodbye. They'd been friends for 12 years. And now they were being separated. And she said that was the most tragic. But that's what Bainbridge was. And so when it came time for the people to be removed, the high school said anybody who wants to can go down and say goodbye to their friends. Other kids skipped school to do that. There was one young man whose friends, he had been great friends with many of the others who had just graduated. He told his boss, he said, I don't care, you can dock my pay, but I'm going to go say goodbye to my friends. And I think that's why Bainbridge was different, because we did all know each other. There was no other. And so when it came time for them to be removed, people stored, well, the Nishimoris stored a family's dishes. The Sakai rugs were taken care of by a family. People took care of animals. People took care of just everything. And that, my folks get the credit, but it was Bainbridge Island. There were individuals across Bainbridge Island. There was an attorney who said, anybody from the Japanese community who wants my help, it's free. There was a man who sold insurance, who bucked his national company, saying, who didn't want him to give insurance to the Japanese because they were very, very high risk. He said, I don't care what they say. I'm writing policies. You come to me, you will be insured. Things like that happened all over the island. And it was reported generally in the review, but not all these little things that people did. So it's not as well known as what my parents did, but I think it is essential to understanding the Bainbridge Island story. You saw Lily, her sweet mother had a lovely friend, Mrs. Norman, who was very tall and in later years had wonderful white hair. She's interviewed at one time saying, I just didn't know what to do for my friend. And you could hear the pain in her voice. So that's the background. And this is what my parents did. They had a newspaper, a very small newspaper. 1940s newspapers were pretty chatty. I tell the kids that they're like Facebook. Everything that happened was in the review, so everybody read the review. And what my parents did, first they came out, as Clarence said, with an extra on the 8th, saying, this is what you need to do if the church bells ring. Don't drive at night with your lights, cover your windows, those kinds of things. But the main thing was what Clarence mentioned, the editorial. And all along the left column was, we have 350 people living here who have no connection let's not go off half-cocked. Let's be sensible. Let's realize that our neighbors are not part of the group that should be sent away. So that was the first thing that they did. And then they spoke out continually throughout the war. The only newspaper that I'm aware of that did that consistently throughout the war. They hired high school kids. Paul Ataki was the first. He was a teenager, a shy teenager who came in after press night and cleaned up. And my folks went to him and said, Paul, we're going to hire you as $5 a month. I don't know. We're going to hire you to be our correspondent in Manzanar, and then of course later in Minidoka. Send us the news. Tell us who won the baseball game, who broke his leg, the kind of chatty news that is in every 1940s small town newspaper. And so he did. And then when he went off to join the MIS in the Pacific, there was a second one, and then there was a third one, and the fourth one was Saakura, who was a gentle lady. And at one point, Clarence alluded to the anti-Japanese meetings on the island toward the end of the war. And she said, I'll stop writing if that will help. I don't want to build up anything. And my folks wrote her back and said, no, please, you've got to keep the column going. It's essential. And so that was the way that the Japanese neighbors who, as my mother said, were away for a while, were always in the news. They were always in Island's purview. And they offered also, my parents offered what was called the open forum, where they would publish letters, and they published every letter they got as long as it wasn't libelous and it was signed. And there were lots of letters that came in, many from overseas. There was a letter from the Rabers who said, well, we're off to Montana to see how the Kura boys are doing. There were letters from people serving overseas. There were letters from Islanders supporting their friends the Japanese friends who were serving overseas. It's quite an interesting, if you have a fascination with this, the last, in November and December and January, toward the end of the war, the conversation that the island had with itself about this issue is fascinating to read. The most, I think, significant thing that they did was to keep the neighbors who were away for a while as part of the island community. And it was, people wrote letters to their friends. People traveled, like the Rabers. During the middle of the war, with all of the rationing, they went to Montana, where the Kura boys were working, to see how they were. It truly is amazing how the island supported its people.
Those who might remember the wall, that was one of the last quotes on the wall from the Kuras, talking about Mr. Raber looking after their farm. And if I'm not mistaken, Mary, it was a dollar transaction, right?
$1. The Rabers bought the Kuras, which was huge. They bought their farm for $1, and after the war, they bought it back, or the Kuras bought it back for $1. And during the time the Rabers had maintained their farm and their farmhouse, many islanders did that. It's unusual that there was one island farmer who had a big farm and who never made connections to somebody pay the taxes. I'd like to know about that more, but many people took care of things like that for their friends.
Thank you, Mary. What's our time like, moderator here? I don't want to get into other parts of your program.
We're scheduled for a 5-minute break at 11.
11,
and it is
okay.
10:35.
Yeah,
currently.
perfect, terrific. Maybe this is a good time to open it up for questions. I'd be happy to direct it to whoever you'd like to have address your issue or question.
Yeah, I can just start off with some questions we had in the chat. And then again, teachers, feel free to continue asking questions in the chat and we'll get to them. So the first question, the first batch of questions is actually for Lily. Sorry, I may need to unmute you, Lily. Do you see that button that's popping up? Can you just hit yes on that, please? See that? There you go. Perfect. Okay. So the first question is from Andrea. And so the question is, did they let you garden in the camps?
This is for me.
I think it's just this first group of questions is just generally asking about what life in camp was like. If you wanted to start off from what you remember, then maybe other panelists that have the content could chime in after that. Does that work?
Tell them the story about the creek and the guard tower. Lily.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Oh, go ahead, Mary. Yeah, you can ask her.
I was just going to say, Lily, tell them the story of the creek and the guard tower.
About,
The creek and the guard tower.
well, I decided to explore the camp more, and so I wandered away from my block. And when I got quite a ways away, I came upon a creek, and I got so excited because there's a creek on our farm, where I didn't mention that I was born on Bainbridge Island on the farm that we lived on. But anyway, I used to play in this creek, and here I found a creek in camp, and so I started to take my shoes off, and then I heard something, and I looked up, and there was a guard tower with a soldier at the top with a machine gun, and that scared me. And so I grabbed my shoe and I ran all the way back to the barracks, and I never told my mother what I had done or what I had seen, and I never went back to that creek again. I think that was an inkling that this was really I heard my mother say that I eventually did say to her, what kind of vacation is this anyway?
Lily, that story leads really well into two questions that talked about how your experience as a child was so different from the experience of your parents. So do you remember your parents talking about their experiences in camp at all?
They did not talk about it. All I know is my father was a lifelong Republican, and he just was angry with President Roosevelt, who was a Democrat. And other than that, I don't remember anything derogatory or any discussion about that time in camp. And I don't think people talked much about it at all. And my feeling is because it's part of their culture, is that bad things happen, but you what is it called? There's a Japanese term where you suck it up and you get on with your life, and people had become successful or had been able to move on, and they didn't want to make waves anymore. And besides that, if you talk about it, you're in essence going to be criticizing the government. And the whole time, I think most Japanese Americans were trying to show that they were loyal Americans. And if you criticize the government, immediately you're labeled as an American. I mean, that goes on today. Just look what happened to Kaepernick when he took a knee during the national anthem. I mean, look how criticized he was for that one event. And so it wasn't until the government actually apologized that I think people felt comfortable talking about it. And I think that, well, then I think the younger generation, when they learned of what happened, that's when it opened up for everyone to feel free to talk more about what happened, and it's done more willingly today. And as Clarence said, let it not happen again. And unless you talk about it, well, it's always pushed under the rug, and if it's not talked about, it sometimes people think it hadn't ever happened at all, and so. Anyway, that's my theory.
Thank you, Lily. So we're just
Hey,
gonna.
may I jump in there, Melissa,
Oh,
quickly?
yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
On the gardens thing, the camps, I think every single camp started growing their own food, produce, and other things, because when they first arrived, they weren't like today's meals ready to eat, and there are all these different like microwavable TV dinner things. It was awful food. I mean, well, Lily, tell me about this is a good segue. So tell us about your first foods and your reaction to them, the spinach in particular.
I'm sorry, my hearing must be going, but you want me to.
Yeah, I'm talking about food in the camps, and I remember you talked about how when you first got there, it's all these
About
canned
the
things.
food in camp?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, that was another thing that I guess repressed it or didn't think about it until I happened to see Les Miserables, and it showed the children all lined up in a row to get their food, and I thought, oh, that was just like in camp. And so I remember the first trip to the mess hall where we all lined up to get our food, and I got all excited because they gave us these round metal tins, and when you opened it up, there inside was a collapsible metal cup that you pulled open, and it became a cup, and there were metal spoon, knife, and fork on it. But anyway, in the handle, so then you went down the row, and the people put food on there. And so first came some potatoes, and then some what looked to me, it was tiny weenies, and I never saw those before. And it was Vienna sausages, but I called them tiny weenies. And then on plopped this big blob of army green glob, and I didn't know what that was. But anyway, we all sat at what looked like picnic tables, and we all sat and well, we're supposed to, in those days, children were supposed to clean our plates. And when I took one bite of that globby green stuff, I didn't like it, and I didn't know what it was. Well, it turned out it was canned spinach, which we never had. We just had fresh homegrown spinach, and it was never cooked like that. And so I refused to eat it. And everyone's telling me, oh, you got to clean your plate. And then pretty soon they're telling me, oh, this is what Popeye the Sailor Man eats, and it makes him strong. And anyway, I can't even remember, but I think at home I would have thrown it on the floor for the dog to eat. But anyway, I can't remember what happened, but I'll never forget that first bite of canned spinach.
And you have to appreciate,
those are pretty good.
Yeah, she's coming from eating fresh fish, fresh game, fresh produce from the garden. I mean, it was totally.
No, but eventually the incarcerees did plant gardens and grow their own vegetables, and then they did have better cooks, and they were able to get rice and Japanese staples, I think, into the camps. I don't know how that was managed, but the food did improve eventually. But we were the first incarcerees there, and we were getting army fare, actually. That was what we were served, was regular army fare.
Right. Well, to segue into that, a lot of these farms, they became so productive that they're actually feeding America. I mean, their excess produce was going out to communities. They often went to the war effort. So they were doing a lot of that on their own. And by the way, these are deserts. So to getting the irrigation and all of that was just Herculean. And if I might add, Manzanar, Bainbridge Islanders, most of them left, but they built an amazing garden there with like waterways and bridges over them and trees. I mean, it was a little oasis that was totally manufactured. They brought in big rocks. It's quite spectacular. It was just recently archaeologically dug out, so you can see the remnants of what they built, and it was apparently well built because it's all there.
They did have a Japanese garden too that
Yeah.
they constructed there.
So this is actually a great segue into some questions for Donna. So one question from Andrea was, have you kept the shop and gardens in the family?
Yes, we've been very fortunate to keep it in the family. So I'm the third generation of my family to work there. And as I was saying, there are lots of trees there that my grandfather had started, and customers remember my parents with fondness. And so I'm very fortunate to be able to keep running the store with my brothers.
Great. So we're gonna transition now. These questions are really for anybody. They're kind of just more general historical questions about the camp experience. So first question from Caroline, was there an effort to keep extended families together?
That's pretty open-ended. Well, I would just kind of come counterpoint on that. Lily's father was arrested, so I think it was a little bit of the opposite. They didn't discriminately split up families. In this case, parents, fathers usually. So keeping the extended family together, they weren't too keen on keeping the nuclear family together. And it was hard to have extended families. One of the reasons why Lily and others went to Minidoka, because they had relatives and friends from the Seattle area that they could be with and look after their children and those sort of things. So in that way, they had a way to create an extended family. But and again, I remember pointing out on the map how the government had split up all of the removals and different neighborhoods instead of holding a neighborhood together. So there was some full separations of families that your son or daughter or wife might have lived in a different part of town, or maybe across the bay or whatnot, but they weren't going to go with you because they weren't in that section. So there was, so to answer that question, there was no real effort to keep extended families together because they didn't care.
Next question, again, more generally about conditions in the camps. What was the medical availability in the camps, and what was medical care like?
There was a center. There were physicians, all of whom were white. One of ours, Kay Sakai at the time, worked there in general office work, I think. So there was one. Fumi Hayashida gave birth there. It was I don't know what it was, very sparse. It was she had a baby, basically, was what happened. And it was difficult for her.
For those who have seen the show MASH, mobile or support hospitals, those are pristine research facilities compared to the medical ability and services that were available in the camps. It was, as Mary said, very rudimentary, very basic.
All right, so we just have like a handful of questions left. So the next two are actually for you, Lily. And then the final two are more about legacy. So I'll open that back up to everybody. So Lily, the question is, how did you feel as a child to be suddenly separated from your school, teachers, and classmates?
Well, it was as if we didn't take vacations, and it was as if I don't remember missing my classmates, but I do remember when I returned to school, they were the same classmates that I had 3 years before because people didn't move much. And I was welcomed back as if I were gone on vacation, and it must be Bainbridge Island, but I don't remember any untoward events on my return. And people ask how schooling was in camp, and it was in one of the barracks was a schoolroom, and I remember we had this typical school books, and I think at first the schools were taught by incarcerees who were teachers or educators, but eventually it was teachers who came from the outside. And I remember my second grade teacher was Miss Schmidt, who was kind and actually took us on a field trip outside of camp to the town of Twin Falls, and that's probably why I didn't. I mean, it was very exciting because she took us to downtown Twin Falls and took us to a 5 and dime, and she gave each of us a dime to spend any way we wanted to. And so that was really exciting. And then she took us to a soda fountain, and so we all were able to get ice cream cones, which was something we just didn't get in camp at all. And so Miss Schmidt was kind. And see, and I don't remember all of my school teachers, but I remember Miss Schmidt from camp because it was so special, and she was so special. And it's either because we're all very smart, but school must have been just fine, because I don't remember any of us having to repeat a grade once we got back from camp. I mean, we just continued at a regular grade level. So,
Well, that's probably because you were.
except that I do know that high school students suffered more, because I remember Kane Akao saying how she or her younger siblings had, when they didn't have typewriters to learn typing on, so they learned to type on paper, or chemistry students didn't have things like Bunsen burners or things, and so the high schoolers and junior high students probably had a harder time, but for elementary school students, it was well, I'm just going by how I managed, but it seemed to be okay.
If I might just segue in there.
Go ahead.
It's a good time to mention, because she talked about this, Ms. Schmidt. The War Relocation Authority was the civilian organization that administered the camps. There were military personnel, but they were the ones in charge. And mostly, many of them didn't like what they were doing. I mean, it was their job, but they saw that this was not right. But they were employees of the government, so you really were careful to speak out. But there were and there were annuals of the camp. Some of the administrators, a Manzanar administrator in particular, he just came close to the line of what the hell am I doing here? And so a lot of those things that happened later, a lot of the amenities was because a lot of the compassion and I believe patriotism on some of these War Relocation employees. They had a job to do, but they didn't necessarily agree with what the mission was.
So we have one more quick question for Lily, and then we'll transition into the legacy pieces. So Lily, Yvonne is curious if you know Frank Koba, who went from Bainbridge to Manzanar to Moses Lake.
I knew of his family. Yes, they're Bainbridge Islanders, and they had a large farm, I think, on the east side of Seattle. I'm trying to remember, but originally they had a large farm on Bainbridge Island. And I think he was active. The Kobas were active in the Japanese Baptist Church, and the Japanese Baptist Church played a significant role during the incarceration because their minister, Reverend Andrews, did so much for his constituency.
Great, thanks. So going into the two legacy questions, the first one's going to be about Washington State. And then the next one is just going to be about legacy of the incarceration in general. So Jade said, all the history about the Bainbridge Island Japanese American community is amazing and so relevant to us here in Washington. Were there other communities with sizable Japanese populations in Washington? I imagine Seattle, but others? If so, do others have memorials like Bainbridge Island? So I actually happen to know the answer to this question is yes, because my grandfather's family is from Toppenish, Washington. And then if it's okay, just briefly on the family separation, my grandfather was separated from his parents and his brother. My grandfather was sent to Heart Mountain in Wyoming, while the rest of his family was sent to Nissa, which was a farm labor camp in Oregon, which is a separate story. But so that's, of course, obviously Toppenish was one other Japanese American community in Washington, but can our panelists name others?
Okay, first on the second one, the Puyallup Fairgrounds has a small plaque and a remembrance. And a few years ago, they actually had a really lovely display about the Japanese American incarceration as part of one of their festivals. But other places, in Seattle, there are several different places that mark places that were World War II connections. But in terms of same size, Seattle was much larger, and Tacoma had a very sizable population too. But put in mind, we were 276 out of about 3,000, 3,100 perhaps. So it's about 10% of the population, which is quite significant, especially back
then. All right, and our final question from Kimberly. As a teacher, there is a fine line we walk when teaching about these sad moments in history. We want our children to understand what has happened, but we also have seen, particularly with teaching about MLK or Ruby Bridges, we end up focusing on the sad part. And it is very important that we not brush our history under a rug. But what would you wish for us to share with our students?
Oh, I have an answer for that. We had a teacher workshop on the island, and this lovely woman came up to me afterwards and said, I've read your book. I've listened to you guys. This is wonderful. But I teach kindergarten. I don't know. I can't teach it to them. And I said, well, yes, actually, you can. There were kindergarten students in the camps, and they wrote poems, and they played games, and they drew pictures. And you don't have to talk about the pain that the adults knew. Lily didn't know that pain then. Most of the kids in the camp didn't. They were kids. They played marbles. I'm sorry. What's the question?
With this kind of history, and also when teaching about the civil rights movement, right, we focus on the sad part, but what's important for students to take away?
You can teach the exclusion from any angle. It is a universal story. You can teach it from journalism. You could teach it from art. You could teach it from dance. You could teach it from any angle. It was a community, so you can write its history, picking what parts you want. And as you get older, you get some of the pain, and then people really do understand it. But I think it's important to talk about this at every grade level.
May I just add to that? This talk that you just saw, I've been giving it for many years prior to being part of Humanities Washington. But the very third time I gave it publicly was to fifth graders in Kingston. I've talked to that fifth grade class every year since. And one of the students raised her hand and she says, I'm just a kid. What am I supposed to do? And God, catches me off guard. I don't know where some of this stuff comes from. I just pulled it out of nowhere. And I said, one of the things you can do is when people are feeling alone or afraid or challenged, stand by them. If there's a child, one of your classmates that always sits alone at lunch, go sit with them. You don't have to talk to them if you don't want to, but just be present. Or if there's someone being bullied, stand behind them. You can feel your presence. It's a thing that human beings feel. And I used that was the metaphor. I said, Bainbridge Island got that. They stood by their friends and neighbors. It wasn't just a metaphor. They actually did this physical action and had their backs, and they supported them in every way they could. So that's what you can do. In times of, and this was a national thing, this is a fear throughout the nation, but there's little things in your own community and little things in your own school that there's those situations that students are challenged, you could be like Bainbridge and just stand by them. And that could be, that's a real lesson right there. If you can just do that little bit.
There's a great story. I'll try to keep it brief. When Mr. Kitamoto came to the island to see if it was going to be safe for his family to come back. So he was on the ferry. He knew almost everybody on the ferry. Some people walked away from him. Others said, Frank, hi, when are you going to bring the family back? An attorney on the island who was quite a character. She was very tall. She always wore outlandish hats and she smoked a corncob pipe. Everybody knew her too. She came up to where Frank was, Mr. Kitamoto was, and just stood a few feet behind him as he walked around and saw people. It was obvious what she was saying is, if you're going to mess with Mr. Kitamoto, you got to go through me. I'm his friend. You know, I mean, it was just an automatic thing on her part. I don't think she thought much about it, but it did make a difference.
Right, so that was the last of our questions. So thank you so much.
Just a thought, any final words, Donna or Lily?
No, just to echo what you said. I'm lucky that I am invited to give my Bainbridge Gardens history to fifth graders on the island. And what you were saying, that usually fifth graders are really stunned that this could have happened. And I'm glad that they feel outraged at that. But that's the lesson, isn't it? That their voices are important. And I usually try to say, wouldn't you be sorry if your friends left? And you know, you need to know where they're going. How would that feel? And wouldn't you welcome them back, which is what Bainbridge did.
And your cat stands by us too, right?
I know. I was trying to do this at home so that I wouldn't be distracted by being at work, but apparently this is just distracting.
I'm ever hopeful, especially after participating and leaving our island with the Sakai sixth graders and how responsive those students are. And I think that's what gives me hope, is because of these young students who understand our stories and realize that well, what it's all about. And I just feel that young people today are much more aware of social justice and how people are people and not so prone to racism as many elders are. So I'm ever hopeful. And thank you for teachers.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Who are interested in who pick up this. Yeah. And they're really the ones who perpetrate all this and get students to understand. So I'm ever thankful about the educators we have today.
Thanks. So I know that we're starting to run over time a little bit. So the last few questions that are in chat, I'm going to go ahead and log those, and we'll have those answers sent to you later. But just looking at the time on the schedule, I think we do need to move on, unfortunately.
Well, thank you for having us.